But tonight's program, we've got Dr. Charles Hyde, and it's funny to hear Penny say our speakers get better and better and better, since this is Dr. Hyde's third time with us. So we'll see. We'll see. But it's certainly a distinct pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Charles K. Hyde. We first spoke in 2005 when he delivered a wonderful program about former Grosse Pointers Horace and John Dodge and his book on the Dodge brothers. And in May 2010, presented a speech about his next book after that one, Storied Independent Automakers, Nash, Hudson, and American Motors. And he focused on the visionary leaders who managed these companies, including Grosse Pointers, Roy D. Chapin, A. Edward Barrett, and Roy Chapin Jr. Dr. Hyde grew up in the Berkshire area of Western Massachusetts. He earned a BA degree in history from the University of Mass Amherst, and then earned a master's and PhD in history from the University of Wisconsin. For more than 34 years, he was a professor of history at Wayne State University until his recent retirement. And we're very lucky that he ended up in Detroit and became interested in automotive history. On a personal note, I certainly admired Charlie's work for many years, attending many of his lectures, and have had the privilege of working with him on the board at the Fort Piquette Avenue plant, where he wrote the nomination that led to that plant's inclusion on the National Register of Historic Landmarks. And he also led the recent effort to recreate Mr. Ford's office, which is incredible. It looks like he just got up and walked away from his desk. He also joined the board at the Piquette plant in 2005. Also had the good fortune to serve with Charlie on the National Automotive History Collection Board for over a decade, where he's been the board chairman for the past few years. And it's great to serve on both of these boards with someone who's so knowledgeable about automotive history. Although he has a reputation of being the Dr. Kevorkian of old automotive factories, since he's also often called upon to lead the final studies of many doomed plants, including Dodge Main, shortly before they're demolished. So it's great that he's helping save the Piquette Avenue plants today the other way around. Dr. Hyde has authored books like Detroit and Industrial History Guide, 1980, Historic Highway Bridges of Michigan, 1993, The Northern Lighthouses of Upper Lakes, 1995, Riding the Roller Coaster, History of the Chrysler Corporation, 2003, The Dodge Brothers, The Men, the Motor Cars, and the Legacy, 2005. And Charlie, you just mentioned that book has sold how many copies already? They've reprinted
5,000.
5,000. They printed it 6 times. And Storied Independent Automakers, Nash, Hudson, and American Motors, 2009. Of course, we mark right now the 100th anniversary of the beginning of World War I last month, and the 75th anniversary this month of the beginning of World War II. So it's great to have Charlie here talking about his 2 most recent books. You see the covers there to Charlie's left, The Arsenal of Democracy, American Automobile Industry in World War II, and its sister photographic book, Images from the Arsenal of Democracy. And of course, Charlie has got copies here to sign and sell to you after the program. So without any further ado, I'll introduce Charlie Hyde. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm not sure I can live up to that introduction, but here we go. This evening, I'm not going to try to summarize the large and complicated story of the auto industry's contributions to the World War II war effort. I would need days and days and days to try to do that. To learn much more about this story, you'll simply have to buy one of my new books. Slide, Mike.
Okay, good. Next.
Arsenal of Democracy, the Automobile Industry in World War II. This is the one that's filled with lots of information. Next. Followed by really a companion volume, Images from the Arsenal of Democracy. It's organized along the same way that the first book is organized, so you can actually buy one of each and read them side by side. I will have copies to sell and autograph at a very substantial discount in the back of the room at the end of my talk. What I want to do tonight is to talk about some of the auto industry's accomplishments during World War II, production accomplishments, which came as a surprise to me as I got into researching this topic, and I suspect a lot of these things are going to be a little bit of a surprise to you as well. I'm going to talk mostly about things the auto industry made that are not particularly well known or entirely unknown. I want to start off by looking at the auto industry's contributions to aircraft production. Keep in mind that the U.S. United States aircraft industry produced fewer than 6,000 aircraft in 1939. From 1940 through 1945, American industry produced 300,000 aircraft. And in the peak year, 1944, we produced 96,000 military aircraft, almost 100,000. It was really a production miracle, unlike, I think, any other. During that period of the war, I'm counting 1940 as the start, the U.S. government spent $45 billion on aircraft. And that was 1/4 of all spending on all weapons. Remember, B-24 bombers and B-25 bombers and B-29 bombers and those fighter aircraft are expensive. They're a lot more expensive than a mere tank or a mere truck. And so that represented a very important part of our spending. The auto industry, which I define to include not just the original equipment manufacturers, but companies that made bodies, parts, tires, and so forth, taken together, they accounted for 1/4 of the dollar value of all the aircraft contracts issued during the war. Okay? So the auto industry was a very, very big player. The importance of this work on aircraft and aircraft components is even more obvious if we look at the defense production by the big three during the war. If we look at the total value of all their contracts for aircraft, aircraft engines, components, propellers, fuselage sections, and the like, for most of the big three, those contracts were more important than anything else they made. Ford, for example, their aircraft work accounted for 61% of all of their war contracts. A lot of that was because of the Willow Run bomber plant, but Ford also made aircraft engines in very large numbers, I think over 60,000 at the Rouge, and lots of other components that went into other people's airplanes. For General Motors, their share of their total production that went for aircraft was 40%. And Chrysler was quite a bit lower at about 30%. Chrysler's share was that low because its contracts for tanks and tank parts accounted for half of what the company did during the war. They were the biggest single manufacturer of tanks during World War II. So how did the aircraft companies, or how did the automobile companies get involved in aircraft production? This is something, you know, other than Henry Ford producing his little tri-motor plane, they really had very little experience in making airplanes. In October 1940, William S. Knudsen, who had been the president of General Motors, but was then serving as the chairman of Franklin Roosevelt's National Defense Advisory Committee, or Commission. They were supposed to ramp up war production. He went to a meeting of the Automobile Manufacturers Association in New York City at the Waldorf Astoria at their invitation. They wanted to sort of find out what was going on with the war production efforts. Knudsen surprised his audience by challenging them to produce $500 million in aircraft parts and components over the next year. At the end of that month, the automobile companies and body and parts makers, along with the major aircraft manufacturers and representatives from the military, they all came together from the Army Air Corps, actually. They all came together in Detroit and established a coordinating committee that was called the Automotive Committee for Air Defense. The initial meeting was held at the what was called the New Center building at that time, and now it's the Albert Kahn building. A total of 85 representatives showed up. Well, the automakers said, you know, we're willing to make this stuff but we need to get our arms around the hundreds of components and sub-assemblies that we might be asked to make. The aircraft manufacturers and the Army agreed to supply this Automotive Council on Air Defense with blueprints and with the actual parts that they were going to be asked to make. The Automotive Council on Air Defense then surveyed existing automobile plants and auto companies to get a sense of which plant and which company might make which part. In November of 1940, can we have the next slide, please? The Automotive Council on Air Defense took over an empty Graham Page plant in Detroit on Warren Avenue and basically turned it into an aircraft components display, featuring components that were needed for the B-24, the B-25, and the B-26 bomber. The B-29 had not been sort of invented at that point. And here you see one of the displays. These are B-26 fuselage sections. So December of 1940. Next, please. B-24 wings and some more fuselage sections. Next slide. What ended up happening is that the between November of 40 and the spring of 41, over 2,000 automotive engineers and production managers, representing about 1,000 companies, visited this display. And by March of 1941, all these companies had signed contracts to make about $1 billion in aircraft components. And I'm not going to try to summarize all the contributions made by all the auto companies to aircraft production. The auto companies did produce some complete aircraft, most notably the B-24 that you see there out at Willow Run. Next slide. Ford also, this is lesser well known, was the most important producer of wooden gliders. These were built and assembled up in Iron Mountain, Michigan at a Ford lumber plant. They were then disassembled up there and shipped by rail after going through some test flights. And eventually, these were used in the Normandy invasion. They were part of that Normandy invasion force. Next slide, please.
You see the Henry Ford Museum to the right. So that's right at the Ford Airport, isn't it? Yep.
Oh, yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
General Motors, which had a lot of unused factory space in the East Coast. By the way, in January of 1942, the automobile companies were prohibited from making any more automobiles for the civilian market.
When was that?
January of 42, which was after Pearl Harbor.
They stopped production
Entirely. Yeah,
Wow.
entirely. A couple of the companies produced cars for a little while. They were all painted khaki, and they became command cars for the Army mainly. But General Motors established a separate division called the General Motors Eastern Aircraft Division, and they used several factories that they had in Delaware, New Jersey, New York State, and Maryland to build two carrier-based aircraft designed by the Grumman Company, which was then located in New Jersey. The first was the Wildcat carrier-based fighter, and you see the assembly line here in Linden, New Jersey. And interestingly, the Avenger, I'll show you some more pictures of that, was also, this was a torpedo aircraft. That was assembled in the same factory on a separate line. Next slide, please. Yeah, and here you see the Avenger assembly in Trenton, New Jersey. Over time, Grumman stopped making these two aircraft on their own, and they went on to focus on the Hellcat, which was an even better fighter aircraft. And the last few years of the war, General Motors basically made all of these two models of Grumman airplanes. Again, how many of you were aware of that? Okay, I've done my job. Well, Mike knows everything, so.
No, I don't. Automotive history is more than a hobby, you know that.
Next slide, please. Another little known fact, Nash Kelvinator built about 300 helicopters under license from Sikorsky, and they built them here in Detroit out at their plant, I'm forgetting the street it's on.
Plymouth Road, yeah.
Plymouth Road, yes, it's right there in front of me. And they had a little tiny landing strip right behind the factory, and that's where they tested them. But they didn't make a lot, and I think they were all made in 1945, towards the end of the war.
That remained Chrysler Jeep engineering until a few years ago. Sadly, it's now being torn down and is all vandalized.
Right. I'm going to show you a lot of slides in just a very few minutes, but Chrysler, Hudson, and the body companies in particular, Murray Body, Briggs, and Fisher Body, made a lot of wings, nose sections, tail sections, fuselage sections, and the like. And the body companies in particular were really naturally suited for stamping out and fabricating these aluminum fuselage parts, because they had the equipment in place that they had been using to stamp out steel body parts. And they simply had to change over the dies and change some of their methods, and they became big producers of these components. Next slide. I'm just going to show you a few samples here. Outer wing sections of the Murray Body plant in Detroit, B-17s, B-26 fuselage sections, Hudson plant. Next. These are Briggs and Fisher Body built. These are built in different plants, B-24 dorsal fins, arriving at the Glen Martin assembly plant in Omaha, Nebraska. As the war proceeded, the aircraft companies, in essence, became assemblers of airplanes using parts made by the auto industry and by other manufacturers. Only Boeing, because of their situation in the Northwest, only Boeing made most of their own parts. These other companies became assemblers. And the miracle to me is they shipped all this stuff from Detroit out to Omaha and to these plants in Texas. They're up in the middle of nowhere, so they'd be safe from the Japanese bombers, I guess. Yes?
What facilitated all that cooperation? I mean, nowadays, I'm not going to give you my hydraulic.
Well, I can talk a little bit more about that at the end as well.
Just curious.
But there was initially there was tremendous suspicion on the part of the aircraft manufacturers that the auto industry was going to get into aircraft manufacturing and put them out of business. Well, they were promised that with a couple of exceptions, the Ford B-24s built at Willow Run and these aircraft that GM built for Grumman, the auto companies didn't build any complete aircraft. So in a sense, they were not a threat. The prime contracts for all the airplanes went to Boeing and Lockheed and Consolidated and Douglas, all the big aircraft companies. And so they didn't feel threatened. So they finally cooperated. Without getting into it in great detail, you'll learn more when you read my books, is that before the war, the aircraft manufacturers were used to making sometimes only 200 or 300 planes a year. And they were making them in small batches, 50 of this, and 30 of this, and 25 of this. And they were not mass produced. They were basically handcrafted. They had blueprints, but the blueprints didn't mean very much. And when they assembled their airplanes in the old way, they used two methods. One was bump to fit. But basically, when things didn't fit, you hit it with a mallet until it did. And the other was file to fit. If it was too big, you filed it down enough so it would fit. Well, you can't make airplanes in large numbers if you're going to make airplanes that way. And what happened in the course of the war is the auto industry taught the aircraft industry how to do mass production. The blueprints had to be right. And once you got into this business of components coming from all over the country to some factory in Texas, the blueprints had to be right because the parts had to fit. There was one occasion early in the war where Hudson made some wing sections for some aircraft that was assembled, I think, out in Missouri, and the blueprints were wrong. And so when these wings were shipped out there, they didn't fit into the fuselage. They were too big. And the aircraft company had screwed up the blueprints, basically. Well, as the war proceeded, they did begin to cooperate and work very nicely together. And it really was a miracle. Because some of those aircraft that flew had parts from 30 or 40 different manufacturers. It came from all over the country.
Detroit had already mastered the bump to fit process 50 years before and given it up.
Yeah, well, you really can't get mass production out. The other thing, without continuing with it too long, the other thing that drove the auto industry crazy, particularly the engineers, is that the Army Air Force wanted to change the specifications of these airplanes all the time, every week. And you can't do mass production if you're changing the design all the time, because then you got to change the machinery. And what they finally came to a compromise, and this really, I think, got going at the Willow Run plant. At Willow Run, they would leave the design frozen for about 6 to 8 weeks and just make lots of them. And then they would stop and make all the changes at once that the Air Force wanted. And then they'd make another batch for 8 or 10 weeks. And that was the only way they could get any production out of the plant. You couldn't be shifting things around every 3 or 4 days. But remember, all these products, not just the planes, but Jeeps and tanks and so forth, they were all brand new for World War II. None of them were around in 1940. And so they were never really properly tested until they got out in the field. The soldiers and the airmen did the testing. And you know, the first Chrysler tanks that were in North Africa, the reports came back, these tanks are overheating. You've got to improve the cooling system. So they did. But there's no substitute for testing these machines in the heat of battle. And that's how it went. I don't think a single major piece of military equipment used in World War II was in use by the Army in 1940. I don't think a single thing, except maybe some of the carbines. Anyways, let me go on here. Next slide. Yeah, B-29 stabilizers made by Fisher Body in Cleveland. Next. Rear fuselage sections made here in Detroit. Next. Another interesting picture. These are Hudson-built B-29 tail gunner cabins that had been shipped to the Glen Martin plant in Omaha, Nebraska, and they were ready to be spliced onto the back end of those airplanes that were under assembly. Notice,
Women wiring.
all the workers you see in the picture are women.
Very good.
Next slide. Again, B-29 cockpit assemblies here at Chrysler. Next. I love this picture, B-29 engine cowlings. They always look to me like little baby bees coming out of the little beehives. Next. And again, just for purposes of the general illustration, this is Boeing's big B-29 assembly plant in Wichita, Kansas. Again, made with parts sent from all over the country. Next. One other very important area of contribution was that Nash Kelvinator made something like 40% of all the propellers used in these airplanes. They had 2 enormous factories in Lansing that made the bulk of them. As you know, aircraft cannot fly without engines and propellers. The auto industry was a major supplier of both. Between 1940 and 1945, American automobile manufacturers supplied American manufacturers altogether supplied the aircraft industry with 802,000 engines. The auto industry produced 56% of those. Half of all the aircraft engines were made by the auto companies. In 1944, which was the peak year for aircraft engine production, the auto industry actually accounted for 3/4 of all the aircraft engines used in combat aircraft. And like I said, Nash Kelvinator made a lot of the propellers. Before the war, there were only 3 significant producers of aircraft engines in the United States. One was Pratt & Whitney, located in Connecticut. One was the Wright Aeronautical Corporation, which I think was based in New Jersey. And the Allison Division of General Motors, which was in Indianapolis, near Indianapolis. During the course of the war, there were some liquid-cooled engines made by companies like Packard Motor Car Company. Next slide, please. This is the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine plant at the Packard complex. Remarkably intact today. If you go there, you may want to bring a weapon with you or something.
But that's what you see from I-94.
Yeah, that's what you see from
going west on the
I-94.
left-hand side. Yeah.
And they have covered over the glass with plywood, and it was being used for storage until recently. And it's very secure, and the scrappers have not gotten into it yet. And there it is, right on the edge of I-94.
Somebody's not doing their job.
Well, it's not working, but yeah. But in any case, this is a nice construction photograph. Next slide. Yeah, these are some engines being prepared for testing at the Allison plant in Indianapolis. Next. Most of the other engines, let me clarify this a little bit. Only 18% of all the engines were these liquid-cooled, straight-line engines. They're mostly V8s or bigger. 82% of all the engines were air-cooled rotary engines, which usually had 7 or 14 or 28 or different number of actual pistons on them. These are Wright engines being assembled at the Studebaker plant in South Bend. Next. And by the way, Wright Aircraft preferred to make their own engines, and they only licensed a couple of other companies to make engines for them. One was Studebaker, and one was the Dodge division of General Motors.
Chrysler.
Chrysler, yeah. The Dodge Chicago plant was built in Chicago to make B-29 engines. And here you can see one view of this enormous assembly building, which I think had 3.5 million square feet under one roof. Absolutely gigantic, an Albert Kahn design. Next. And here you see those Wright B-29 engines being assembled at Dodge Chicago. Of all the B-29, all the engines that went into B-29s during the war, 60% were produced at this Chrysler plant in Chicago. And including, I think, the engines that were on the Enola Gay and most other B-29s. So Wright produced about 2/3 of their engines in-house, and they licensed the other 1/3 to the auto company. On the other hand, Pratt & Whitney's licensees accounted for about 2/3 of all the Pratt & Whitney engines made during the war. Their main automotive licensees were Buick. Next slide, please. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't show you all of the rest of these. This is an early Chrysler-built B-29 engine coming out of the Dodge Chicago plant. Next slide. Yeah, this is a B-29. This is not drawn to scale, carrying a gigantic engine on its back. Next slide. Yeah, these are the test cells at the Dodge Chicago plant, and without wandering too far off topic, the one thing I learned was I learned about the very vigorous testing that was done on every single engine made at every single one of these plants. Every engine was put into a test cell and given a 3-hour test on a dynamometer. And they would measure temperatures, fuel consumption, the power that it was putting out, and so forth. They would then let it cool off, disassemble the entire engine into all of its pieces on these benches. I've got pictures of these benches. They would visually inspect every single part for cracks, for wear, for problems. A lot were x-rayed. And after they replaced any defective parts, they'd run the engine for another 3 hours. Only then could they deliver it to the Army Air Force. When you think about it, if a tank engine fails, okay, the guys might get out of the tank and get away. But if you start losing engines from mechanical problems on bombers, and some get shot out by the enemy, they've got to be reliable. And they were pretty reliable because of this inspection process.
They probably used the propellers and not the dynamometers, because they wouldn't have had any other way to cool the air-cooled engines.
Oh yeah, no, they did have propellers on them, but
So they wouldn't have had a dynamometer. Wouldn't have needed it.
well, I'm not sure about that because all the descriptions I had showed them doing that. But the other thing they did was they harnessed the engine power from these test cells to produce electricity to power the plants. And they saved all the heat to help heat the plants. It was all that sort of thing.
By the way, the plant had only one on-off switch. There were no ways of turning on certain sections of light. It
Oh, really?
was designed and produced to be working 24 hours a day or the whole shebang.
Yeah, the other interesting thing too is that that one large assembly building was actually air conditioned because there was such differences in the way aluminum and brass and copper expanded, and you had to control the humidity. So they actually air conditioned this. They used Chrysler air conditioning units, of course, but they actually air conditioned these final assembly areas in most of these plants because it was to control conditions. What Ford discovered to their shock when they first went out to San Diego to see the B-29s being built out there by Consolidated assembled their B-29s outdoors. Now, of course, if you live in San Diego, where it never rains, that's not an issue. I mean, they certainly don't get snow. But the problem is the temperatures, the ambient temperatures between 6 in the morning and 4 o'clock in the afternoon are all over the place. And it made assembly very, very difficult. Next, please. And, oh yeah, so I'm just going to show you some of the plants that did Pratt & Whitney engines under license. This is the Buick Assembly Plant in Melrose Park, Illinois, right outside of Chicago. Next. Chevy Tonawanda plant in western New York State near Buffalo. This plant, I think, was one of the ones that was finally closed and sold by General Motors during the Great Bankruptcy. Next. I mentioned the Ford Motor Company made a lot of engines as well, and this is the engine assembly line at the Ford Rouge plant. Next. Kelvinator made them in Kenosha. Next. I'm going to talk about an oddball product that some of you may know something about. Rather than talk about Jeeps and tanks and regular trucks, I want to talk about this amphibious vehicle known as the Duck, D-U-K-W. In March of 1942, the Quartermaster Corps began working with the Yellow Truck and Coach Division of General Motors, which eventually became GMC Truck, to develop an amphibious vehicle based on General Motors' standard 2.5-ton capacity 6x6 truck. And here you see basically a GM 6x6 truck chassis fitted with a body that was a boat. It's floatable. It was originally designed to be a cargo carrier to allow for delivery of cargo to the beach and to places where there weren't any ports. It was eventually used for some movement of troops as well. After some prototyping and testing, the Quartermaster Corps approved the design that Yellow Truck had offered, and gave them the exclusive contract to make these ducks. They started production at the truck plant in Pontiac, Michigan, which I think now is no longer used for truck manufacturing. Yellow Coach became the exclusive manufacturer. They eventually turned out more than 21,000 ducks. And there are still quite a few of them around today being used for tourist purposes. Wisconsin Dells, Wisconsin has a bunch of them, and Boston has a bunch. After vanquishing the Tigers and winning the World Series, the Boston Red Sox had their celebration parade in 7 or 8 ducks. And they went through the streets of Boston, crossed the Charles River into Cambridge, which they're capable of doing, went around in Cambridge. I think they went out into Boston Harbor briefly, and then they came back into the streets of Boston. Next, I'm just going to show you a bunch of these. I call this a flock of ducks at the GM plant in Pontiac. Next, here you'll see some of the use. This duck down in the water is being loaded with gasoline cans at the Le Havre, France. You can see the gasoline cans. But eventually all these vehicles you see on deck are going to be moved by duck from the water to the beach. Next, one of my favorite ones, a 2.5-ton GM truck on 2 ducks that are lashed together. And the beauty of this is you can then run the duck right up onto the beach and you drive the truck off from it.
Did they have any particular advantage over the landing crafts? Didn't have the drop-down fronts?
Yeah, well, the landing craft were, I mean, they were also used for some, but these tended to be used during, after the initial battles were over. So they, you know, they weren't going to be subject to direct enemy fire.
You actually see landing craft right up there to the right on the deck. See that?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yes. Next, a White Motor Company half-track, which weighed 9 tons, atop 2 ducks that are tied together. Next. Here's a duck that is being used for troop movements, and you can see that bridge across the Danube is out of service.
I guess so.
Next. One of the other things that surprised me was the manufacture of anti-aircraft guns by Chrysler, Hudson, and a couple of other automakers. In January of 1941, Chrysler agreed to mass produce a 45mm anti-aircraft gun called the Bofors gun. The Bofors was a Swedish design which Chrysler's engineers had to convert from metric dimensions to inches before they went into production. And here you see a Chrysler worker inspecting Bofors guns barrels. I always thought he looks a bit like Jay Leno. That's what he was snout. By the end of the war, Chrysler had turned out over 30,000 single-mounted versions of these Bofors guns for the Army. That was 90% of all the ones the Army bought, and 14,000 double-mounted or double-barreled Bofors guns for the Navy, and 120,000 extra barrels. Apparently these things wore out the barrels pretty quickly. Next. These were all assembled, by the way, at Chrysler's Lynch Road assembly plant in Detroit. Next. Here you see a U.S. Army version on alert in New Guinea. The thing I love about this particular picture is there's an airplane landing on the background, a landing strip. Next, this is the standard U.S. Navy double-barrel version of the Bofors. Next, and one of my favorite slides, this is a Bofors gun on a U.S. Navy warship near Wake Island. If you look carefully, there's 2 aircraft carriers out in the background, and I think this is around the time of one of the big battles that was fought there. And what's fun about the picture, they're cut off a little bit, is there are 2 sailors catching catnaps down here in the foreground before the next battle. Next, the other gun, anti-aircraft gun, was made by the Hudson Motor Car Company. It was the Orlikon gun which was of Swedish design, and that also had to be converted from the metric dimensions to inches. Hudson agreed in April of 1941 to build these Oerlikon guns at a brand new naval arsenal that was to be built in Centerline, Michigan. And by the time Hudson lost this contract, which they did in the middle of the war, they had already built over 33,000 Oerlikons. Pontiac also built Oerlikons for the U.S. Merchant Marine. Next slide. Yeah, there you see a bunch of Oerlikon guns in Centerline ready to be delivered. Over the course of the Second World War, most anti-aircraft guns found on U.S. naval vessels in the Pacific were one of these two. They were Bofors or they were Oerlikons. They also had machine guns on top of that. Transitioning to machine guns, the other thing that surprised me was that 4 divisions of General Motors built machine guns in very large numbers. Next slide. They built machine guns at the Saginaw Steering Division up in Saginaw, at AC Sparkplug in Flint. Frigidaire Division built them at Dayton, Ohio, and the Guide Lamp Division built some in Syracuse. In September of 1940, the U.S. Army Ordnance Department came to General Motors and asked them if they would build about 71,000 machine guns under contract. And these were 30 caliber Browning models and 50 caliber Browning models. So the original contract was for 71,000 machine guns. By the end of the war, General Motors had turned out 1.9 million machine guns, 70% of all U.S. production. They were the big producer of machine guns. The auto industry, next slide please. Yeah, and there's some assembly going on at AC Sparkplug. Next slide. The other thing the auto industry made in great quantity were shells, bombs, and small arms cartridges. General Motors alone manufactured 120 million artillery shells. 13% of all the artillery and mortar shells purchased during the war came from just General Motors. Chrysler made 101,000 incendiary bombs. Next slide. One of my favorite images, this is a woman doing inspection of 155 millimeter shells at Fisher Body's plant in Grand Rapids. Wonderful picture. Next. And this man is locating and reinforcing a freight car that's going to be fully loaded with these 155 millimeter shells for shipment. Next.
They're not armed yet.
No, I don't believe so.
Yeah, so they put gunpowder or whatever in them.
I think that happened later. The other interesting thing I discovered is right after Pearl Harbor, an Army Ordnance officer came to K.T. Keller, who was the head of Chrysler, and asked him if his company could make several billion cartridges for small arms, mainly 30 caliber and 45 caliber cartridges. Keller supposedly said, "I can't imagine what a billion of anything is like, but I'd like to make a billion of something and find out." And they converted an idle assembly plant in Evansville, Indiana. And here you see one image of that plant. And again, notice that other than this guy with the tie, who's some sort of manager, and this guy who's obviously too old to be in the Army, this is manned by women, or staffed by women. Next.
Where are the safety glasses? Yeah.
No such thing. And again, all the inspectors I saw, except this one old guy, are all women. Next. And one of the most interesting images I ran across, this is the cartridge packing line. And you have to look at it carefully. Every single woman in this packing line is African American. Every single one. They are of different shades and hues and different hair, but they're all African Americans. This was a segregated department. And there's an African American guy delivering stuff and bringing it. The only white guys you see are these managers in their little white shirts back there. And this was true in most of the plants where there were a lot of African American women. They tended to be segregated into just one or two departments.
We couldn't pick a machine to pack boxes.
No, it was, remember, this is prior to a lot of automation. This was cheaper. Plus, I think they may have also been doing a bit of last minute inspection as they're putting the stuff in the boxes. Next, and I am really wrapping up, so don't worry that I'm going to go on forever. One of the exotic products was the Dodge main factory's production of gyro compasses under license from the Sperry Gyroscope Company. These were gyro compasses used in large ships. By the end of the war, Dodge Main had built 5,500 gyro compasses, which was about 5 times the number that Sperry thought they were capable of building. And again, there ain't any men in this picture. This was an all-female workforce.
They're all dressed up too. That's what's
Well, there were
funny.
no uniforms back then.
Yeah.
No, there are no uniforms. They tended to often simply bring their household apron to
Yeah.
work
Yeah.
and wear that. But no protective headgear or glasses or anything. OSHA was not around at this
Right.
time. Probably the war would have been prolonged for 8 years if OSHA wasn't around. Sorry. Next slide. And again, final assembly. One of the great liberating things about working in the auto plants for women is they wore slacks out of necessity. You're not going to wear a dress or a skirt in these settings. So slacks, which were seen as unladylike normally, became the sort of dress of the day. Next, I really am wrapping up. One of the oddball products, and there were many, many of those, was the Sea Mule, which was a little tugboat the Chrysler Corporation developed and built it at the Chrysler Jefferson Avenue plant, and they launched it right into the Detroit River. I'm not sure, I think that's Windsor across the way, but it could be Belle Isle.
Yeah.
It's kind of green.
Fish Island too, yeah.
So, and Chrysler built a lot of unusual things at that Chrysler plant. They actually built a machine that could generate smoke to hide aircraft landing fields from the enemy's aircraft. It generated fog, basically. There were fog machines.
You know what they were used for, the simulators?
They were tugboats. They moved other vehicles around. And Chrysler made some equipment that was used in the atomic bomb manufacturing effort as well. So they produced a wide variety of products, and I've only touched on some of the high points here today. You'll have to read my books, buy my books first, and read them secondly if you want to learn more. How many of you have learned a good deal of new information that you didn't know before you came in here today? On a show of hands. Good. I've done my job as an educator. I must tell you that I knew very little about this until I started investigating, and I knew about the B-24 bombers, and I knew that Chrysler made tanks, and GM made a lot of trucks, and so did Dodge. But the rest of this story I really didn't know about, especially the aircraft part of it. So I'm going to end there. I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have about anything I've talked about or anything I have not talked about. So feel free. Yes, sir.
Any idea what this did to, say, the aluminum industry? Because before the war, we weren't making, airplanes weren't using a lot of aluminum, and then afterwards they have all this capacity to make aluminum, and then we end up seeing things like aluminum foil showing up. These other
Yeah, as I understand it, the Reynolds Aluminum Company really could credit its enormous growth to this wartime demand. Alcoa had been there, but it actually been under attack by the government for being a monopoly. Reynolds got their start, and remember there were also scrap drives during the war to collect aluminum and recycle it, because aluminum was very expensive. But for airplanes, it was really the metal of choice. Other than those wooden gliders that Ford made, you basically, all those aircraft had aluminum bodies, aluminum fuselages, I should say. Yes, ma'am.
What did the letters DUKW stand for?
You have to read my book. And don't ask me to remember each one. It's General Motors code. One of the letters represents the fact that all 6 wheels drive, and one is about which wheels steer, and so on and so forth. It's GM code, but of course, DUKW quickly became duck because it acted like a duck. It was amphibious, right? In and out of the water. Yes. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, you know, I mean, when we think about today and how, you know, the generation for a refrigerator can be like 2 years, 1.5 years, whatever. And you know, a new car, you know, let's put it on the drawing board today, but you won't see it run off the assembly line for 4 to 5 years, 3 maybe.
Yeah,
These guys,
the miracle here really was a miracle of engineering as much as a miracle of production. I'll give you a couple of examples, and some of it was the miracle of construction. I don't talk about it here, but Chrysler broke ground for its tank plant on Van Dyke in Warren in September of 1940. This is before Pearl Harbor.
that's what I'm saying.
The first tanks came off the assembly line in April of 1941. They did that whole plant, they equipped it, they had dry runs, they ran pilot tanks, and in a matter of 7 months, they're spitting tanks out.
They also brought in a couple steam locomotives to supply heat while they're still building.
Yes. Yeah, in my book, I think in both books, I have a wonderful picture of this steam locomotive that they simply brought inside the plant. They didn't have the heating plant done, but they had glassed in the walls. So they basically used the steam locomotive as a giant radiator.
So why can't
They piped in the steam.
Right.
Shot it around.
Exactly.
But why can't that lesson be learned today?
Don't ask for me to get into all of that. But by heating the plant, this is the miraculous thing, they poured concrete inside that plant in November, December, January, and February, and had time for it to cure so they could then install the machines and have this up and running in no time at all. It really was a miracle. Yes, sir?
I think the real miracle of this arsenal of democracy isn't so much of building this equipment, it is the machine tools and the supporting equipment that built the airplanes and the tanks. And you just don't go to Sears and buy a drill press and a couple wrenches and go out and build a tank. It is special machinery from the get-go.
Yeah, and if there was one single bottleneck, it was machine tools. That Chrysler plant in Chicago, that Dodge Chicago plant, was actually built. The plant was finished and ready to go and sat there for almost a year because the Army Air Force was allocating the machine tools they had to other plants.
The War Production Board.
And the War Production Board was part of that as well. So it was a miracle. I will mention just in passing one engineering miracle. As the war proceeded, Chrysler had been using, for tank engines, for their Sherman tanks, engines made by Continental Motors, which was located in Detroit. And those were radial engines. Well, the beauty of those engines is you can use them in tanks, but you can also use them in airplanes. And the Army went to Chrysler and said, you need to design your own tank engine because we want to use all those engines for aircraft. And Chrysler's engineers thought for a while, and of course, Normally, for a car company to produce a new engine from scratch and do all the testing and engineering, you're talking about 2 to 3 years. It doesn't happen overnight. What the Chrysler engineers did was they said, well, we have this perfectly good 6-cylinder engine that we've used in our cars for many, many years, and we actually have all the tooling and the blueprints. They took 5 of those engines, arranged them in a circle. I think each engine produced 160 horsepower. They linked them to a common crankshaft, camshaft and crankshaft, and came up with a brand new tank engine in 3 months. And they equipped 7,500 Sherman tanks with that tank engine at the tank plant. And, you know, part of it was patriotism, you know, K.T. Keller, among others. Part of it was the can-do challenge of taking on the jobs. Knudsen, who knew the auto industry well and he knew the challenges of production, he made a decision early on that the only companies that were going to get large contracts were going to be companies that had large engineering staffs already in place. Where would you find large engineering staffs to do design work in the auto industry? And so it was a natural for the auto industry to get so many of these big contracts. I didn't mention this earlier, but at the beginning of the war, Michigan had something like 6 or 7% of the population of the United States. We ended up producing nearly 15% of the value of all the war contracts in the United States. It was just astonishing what they were able to accomplish.
15 or 50?
15. But you know, that's counting ships and all the other stuff that was made for the war effort. Yeah, it was a miracle of engineering, a miracle of construction, a miracle of production. Nobody knew how to make stuff made of metal in large quantities better than the auto industry. It was a natural. And so they became the bulwark for the whole war production effort. Yes, sir.
One other thing that you have to, you'll see that in our museum, is the furnace companies make gas cannons, the cabinets companies make tents, and there's, all of Michigan really got together, and I know you have some of that in your book as well.
Yeah, my book, by necessity, really focused on the auto industry particularly, and I didn't even try to look at all Detroit or Michigan industries. We were a major producer of Army helmets here in Detroit. There were a couple companies that made millions of these things.
The rescue boats?
Yeah, but I focused on, and the various shipbuilding companies in Michigan built a lot of ships for the war. You know, not big cargo ships, but mid-sized things. But yeah, it was a remarkable story, and my books do focus primarily, almost exclusively on the auto industry. So you're not going to learn about Liberty ships built out on the West Coast if you buy my book. But you'll learn a lot of other fun stuff.
The Continental Engine plant that you mentioned, is that the plant that's behind the post office down there off Jefferson?
Yes, it's right behind where the Hudson plant used to be.
Yeah.
It's the chimney that you see there.
And yeah, there still is a smokestack that I think
That's
says
the engine
Continental.
test cell.
And yeah,
Still
there's some
noticeable.
foundry operations that are still there.
Now, is that just the aircraft engine? Did the early 1790s and 895 tank engines, were they made there also?
Yes, I believe they were. And Continental also, their original plant was in Muskegon, I believe.
No, that was later, that after.
Well, no, I think it was earlier, and they built the plant next to Hudson because Hudson said, if we're gonna buy engines from you, you're gonna have your plant next to us. So for ease of supply and quality control and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, Continental was a big aircraft manufacturer as well. They were probably fourth after, Pratt & Whitney and the others that I mentioned.
Prior to the war, were they making aircraft?
Yes, I think they were, but it was
So
a
they were really an
small,
automotive.
very small operation. It was mainly automotive, I think. But those particular engines that Continental made could be used in either application. Yes, sir.
General World War II. I can't remember the author or the title of the book, but he made a statement that by the middle of World War II, he didn't make it clear whether it was England middle or America's middle of World War II, that Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania was producing more steel than all the Axis companies, all the Axis countries combined.
I would not be surprised, I don't know that.
But, okay, that's not talking Youngstown or Cleveland or
Right.
Rude or Indiana. Somebody should have sent Hitler a postcard.
I should point out too, and I didn't mention it here, that a lot of our production went to our allies through the Lend-Lease program. All the trucks that Studebaker built for General Motors under license from General Motors, every single one was shipped to Russia. And we provided, by 1943, I think, all the British tanks. Britain just stopped making their own tanks, and they were using ours. So we were a major supplier, particularly to Great Britain and the Soviet Union. For all kinds of
Arsenal of
stuff.
democracy.
Yes, yeah, we really were the arsenal of democracy, which was the reference in Roosevelt's original speech. He really said we need to become the arsenal of democracy for the world if we're going to save democracy. And that was a full year before Pearl Harbor.
Okay, well, let's give Charlie a great hand.